Observing your mental habits and not reacting off impulse. Recognizing the patterns that control your decisions. The Stoics would view this idea as one of the foundations of self-mastery. They would argue that freedom begins when you become capable of observing what happens inside your mind without automatically obeying it. Observe the impulse. Examine the thought. Recognize the pattern. Then choose your response. The important distinction is that the Stoics did not believe you could prevent the first emotional reaction from appearing. Anger, fear, jealousy, excitement, resentment, or anxiety can arise automatically. What you can control is what happens after the reaction appears. 1. The Stoics would separate reaction from response. Imagine someone insults you. The first reaction might be, "Who the hell does he think he is?" The Stoic wouldn't necessarily condemn that initial thought. Instead, he would pause and ask, "What exactly has happened here?" Someone made a statement. Then your mind added a meaning. "He disrespected me." Then emotion followed. "I need to defend myself." Then an impulse appeared. "Say something back." The Stoics' intervention occurs between the impulse and the action. That small space is where self-control lives. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly returned to the idea that our judgments about events contribute greatly to our emotional disturbance. The event itself and the interpretation we attach to it are not always the same thing. 2. Observing your mental habits is becoming a student of yourself. The Stoics would encourage you to study your own mind almost like a scientist studying a recurring phenomenon. Instead of simply saying, "I'm an angry person," you begin asking, "What situations consistently make me angry?" Instead of, "I always make bad decisions," ask, "What emotional state usually exists immediately before I make those decisions?" Maybe you discover a pattern. You spend money when you're emotionally frustrated. You contact people when you're lonely. You argue when your ego feels threatened. You make major decisions when you're angry. You seek validation when you feel inadequate. You withdraw when you feel rejected. Now you've discovered something important. You are no longer merely experiencing the behavior. You're observing the mechanism producing the behavior. That is profoundly Stoic. 3. The Stoics would be interested in the moment before the decision. One of the most powerful questions you can ask yourself is, "What usually happens immediately before I do this?" Because habits often have a sequence. Trigger, thought, emotion, impulse, action, consequence. For example, someone criticizes you, you interpret it as disrespect, anger appears, you feel compelled to respond, you say something harsh, conflict follows. Most people focus on the final behavior. The Stoic studies the entire chain. And once you understand the chain, you can interrupt it. Instead of criticism, anger, reaction, you create criticism, observation, examination, choice. That is the development of practical wisdom. 4. Know yourself becomes more than a philosophical slogan. The Stoic tradition places tremendous importance on self-examination. But knowing yourself doesn't simply mean knowing your favorite music, your personality, your strengths, or your weaknesses. It means knowing how you behave under pressure. What happens to you when you're insulted? What happens when you're afraid? What happens when you're attracted to something? What happens when you're jealous? What happens when you lose? What happens when someone gets something you believe you deserve? What happens when your ego is challenged? Those moments reveal your mental habits. A person might believe they're calm until someone challenges their pride. They might believe they're rational until money is involved. They might believe they're independent until someone rejects them. They might believe they don't care about other people's opinions until somebody criticizes them publicly. The Stoic would say, watch yourself. Your reactions are giving you information. 5. An impulse is not an instruction. This may be one of the most useful Stoic ideas for modern life. Just because you feel something doesn't mean you must do something. Anger can say, respond. You don't have to respond. Fear can say, run. You don't necessarily have to run. Ego can say, prove yourself. You don't have to prove anything. Desire can say, I need this. You can ask whether you actually need it. Resentment can say, Get even. You can choose not to. The mind produces impulses. Wisdom decides which impulses deserve obedience. That distinction is critical. 6. The Stoics would probably call this freedom. We often define freedom as having the ability to do whatever we want. The Stoics would challenge that definition. If your anger can make you act against your better judgment, are you really free? If an insult can control your behavior, the person who insulted you has acquired some control over you. If an advertisement can create a desire and that desire immediately controls your spending, something outside of you is influencing your behavior. If loneliness repeatedly causes you to return to unhealthy relationships, loneliness has become a decision maker. If fear consistently determines what opportunities you pursue, fear is effectively directing your life. The Stoic concept of freedom is therefore deeper. Freedom is not simply the ability to act. It is the ability to govern yourself. 7. Recognizing patterns changes the question. Instead of asking, "Why did I do that?" you begin asking, "Why do I repeatedly do that?" That second question is much more powerful. One bad decision can be an accident. Repeated bad decisions reveal a pattern. And patterns reveal something about the relationship between your thoughts, emotions, desires, and behavior. Suppose every time you feel disrespected, you become confrontational. Eventually you recognize, disrespect is one of my triggers. Now the next time it happens, you have an advantage. You recognize the pattern while it is happening. You can tell yourself, here it is again. This is the moment where I normally lose control. That awareness creates distance. And distance creates choice. 8. The goal isn't to become emotionless. This is an important misconception about Stoicism. The Stoic isn't trying to become a robot. The goal isn't, I should never feel anger. It's closer to, I should not allow anger to become my master. You can feel anger and remain rational. You can feel fear and still act courageously. You can feel sadness without allowing sadness to dictate every decision. You can experience desire without becoming enslaved to desire. You can experience ego without allowing ego to drive the vehicle. The Stoic isn't trying to eliminate humanity. He's trying to prevent temporary emotional states from becoming permanent decision makers. 9. Your mind develops shortcuts. Modern psychology might describe many of these processes through concepts such as conditioning, cognitive biases, emotional regulation, and habit loops. The Stoics didn't have modern neuroscience, but they understood something remarkably relevant. The mind becomes accustomed to certain ways of interpreting the world. If you repeatedly respond to criticism with anger, anger becomes easier to access. If you repeatedly respond to problems with panic, panic becomes familiar. If you repeatedly respond to discomfort by escaping, escape becomes habitual. But the opposite can also happen. You can practice pausing. You can practice questioning your assumptions. You can practice delaying gratification. You can practice remaining silent when your ego wants to speak. You can practice examining your thoughts before acting on them. Eventually, the pause itself becomes a habit. 10. The Stoic would ask, who is driving? This may be the deepest question behind your idea. When you make a decision, who is actually making it? Is it your reason? Your fear? Your anger? Your ego? Your loneliness? Your desire for approval? Your desire for revenge? Your insecurity? Your habit? Or simply the desire to feel good in the next 5 minutes? The Stoic would argue that a mature person must increasingly move from automatic living to deliberate living. You don't eliminate emotion. You put emotion in its proper place. You don't destroy desire. You examine desire. You don't eliminate your ego. You recognize when your ego has taken the steering wheel. And you don't believe every thought that enters your mind. You observe it. That is the difference between having a thought and being controlled by a thought. The deeper Stoic lesson. Ultimately, your statement could become a powerful Stoic philosophy. Your first reaction is not necessarily your true decision. Between what happens to you and what you do about it exists a moment of awareness. That moment may be very small. But within that moment is the possibility of self-government. The person who never observes his mental habits is often controlled by them without realizing it. The person who begins observing them can eventually recognize, this is what I normally do. Then, this is why I normally do it. Then, I don't have to do it this time. And eventually, I choose what happens next. That is where Stoicism becomes more than an ancient philosophy. It becomes a practice of mental sovereignty. You don't control every thought that enters your mind. You don't control every emotion that rises within you. You don't control everything that happens around you. But you can become increasingly skilled at controlling what you do with what happens inside you. And perhaps that is one of the most important forms of freedom a human being can possess.